Hi, I'm hopeful that you're going to enjoy this little presentation I've put together here on the case studies that we looked at over the course of the semester here. I want to spend a little more time looking at them. I know we talked about them in class, but I thought it would be helpful to do a sort of summary of this whole theme and get into maybe some overreaching conclusions that we can reach about all of this. First one that I'd like to address is why we chose these subjects. They actually identify or help us understand particular themes in the weeks that we were studying. So as you go back and look at the comments that I'm going to give you today and compare those to what we were talking about back then, you'll see that, that's why they picked that one. We also need to talk a little bit more about why did we pick them, what makes these particular cases so special or interesting. Because we didn't pick these at random. I know that may come as a surprise to you, but we didn't pick them at random. What we did was we picked them based on some very specific reasons, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit today, and finally really identify what the key point of differentiation is for each one of these case studies. First case study, as you remember, was Louis Martini. An amazing history here, in that the Martini family for generations was one of the leading winemaking teams in the Napa Valley. And nationally, if not internationally famous brand. And that structure, that power, that relationship with the market in the 1960s and 70s, when they were possibly one of the 3 or 4 most famous wineries in America, has led to a very different situation today. I think you now know that they are owned by Gallo. The family sold the winery and brand to the Gallo family. And they did this primarily because that is a winery that throughout its history, the president of the winery, the CEO, was always a winemaker. And the result of that was that they consistently explored new wines to produce. They consistently made different wines to produce, but they did not, in fact, ever approach the business from the basis of a marketing perspective. And as a result, rather than developing a powerful brand for a few varietals, by the time they were purchased by Gallo, they were making over 20, and in some figures I've seen have gone over 30 different wines, and not particularly well known for very many of them at all. So an example of a winemaker exploring his palate, having a wonderful time and making, frankly, very well-made wines, but in the end not really connecting on a level with the consumer that makes them easy to understand, easy to appreciate, and easy to identify. They have enormous resources. They have some of the most spectacular vineyards, fewer, frankly, in Napa, more in Sonoma. But they have an enormous opportunity here, and the question is, where do they go? I think the ultimate plan for Louis Martini should be to recapture that image they had in the 60s and 70s of being one of the leading wineries in the Napa Valley. But it will take an enormous amount of investment, it'll take an enormous amount of time, and frankly, it'll take some luck for them to achieve that goal. As it is, they have rebuilt their visitor center experience in the Napa Valley. That will help, but ultimately they need to take aim at producing a very different style and character of wine and moving into a very different realm of the market. We'll see if they do that. Now let's talk about Chianti Classico. Again, as you know, this is one that's close to my heart. I worked with them for many years. And of course, the history of Chianti Classico is in some ways the history of wine in all of Italy. So that's an enormous resource they have there that they can build upon. But what I really wanted to focus with Chianti Classico is this sense that they are both the most traditional of wine-making regions and within Italy, maybe the least traditional. If you remember, our class discussions generally focus around the Gran Selezione wines from the top producers. But if you go back just a few years, Chianti Classico underwent a massive restructuring. They completely redefined the regulations and protocols of the DOCG. They changed the style of wine. They changed the grapes that go into that wine. They even changed the style of pruning. So that Chianti Classico today is simply not the same wine as it was 25 years ago. An amazing change, and when we hold up the DOCG system as a way of protecting regional identity, we have to look at Chianti Classico and say, wow, but if that's regional identity, can regional identity change that much and still be regional identity? I'm going to argue that it can, but we need to talk about it differently and we need to teach it differently, because Chianti Classico clearly has changed the rules, not only for themselves, but for all DOCGs in terms of what it means to be wines from a region. In some ways, they have blended that classic European tradition of we always do everything this way with an absolutely new vision of winemaking that came out of the New World, which says, well, that's the way you do it. We're going to try this. And Chianti Classico has actually allowed those changes to proceed specifically so that they can compete more effectively on the world market. What's next? We'll see if they're successful, but I suspect that with the market strength they have, the power they have as a group, I think that they will continue to be pretty darn successful. A fascinating organization, and again, the president of FederDOC is a friend of mine, Riccardo Ricci Corvastro, and I think they really have a wonderful, wonderful job. Again, what they are, this is the Federation of DOC and DOCG wines in Italy. So they are the organization that supervises all of these regional associations and accounts that are created all over Italy. Hundreds. More than 340 DOCGs and a great number of DOCs and a great number of DOCGs as well. So they set up the protocols, they set up the they finalize the regulations, they confirm the regulations, and then they make sure everybody is playing by the rules. They also offer a individual quality control tracking device that allows consumers to enter the bottle code on that little strip that you see over the top of the bottle and learn about the wine that is produced from the technical aspects studied by FederDOC. Why do they matter? Well, FederDOC is one of those groups, in fact, the group that really allowed Chianti Classico to happen, because FederDOC has a series of protocols in place as to how you determine what your region means to the world. But those regions those regulations are open to change, modification, mutation. And so one of the big challenges they have is, on the one hand, how do we keep this from being an uncontrolled explosion of DOC wines? They have no way of doing that. Remember that Italy, as my friend Riccardo says, is a nation of mountains, and every valley and every mountain chain everywhere in the world believes that it is special and unique and wants nothing to do with that valley just over the ridge on the other side. So each region of Italy always wants its own specific DOC or DOCG. But what they have done is given those areas the opportunity to evolve, to change. Soave is another one that has completely restored its reputation based on the fact that the regulations of the FederDOC, of the DOC organization, allow regions to develop, to improve, and to change the very way they make their wine in order to be a more powerful force in the U.S. market or the world market. Where do they go from here? Well, he has always said that there will be a DOC for every representative in the Italian national government, and I think that's over 600. So will it become more confusing? Yes. Will the questions on your Italian wine exams become more difficult? Yes, or at least more names to remember. But at the same time, FederDOC also will play a key role in protecting the quality of wine in Italy, and also encouraging regions to explore ways that they can move as a group forward to be competitive in the modern market. This was done by as a hope to contrast two regions. Because 25 years ago there wasn't much wine from Romania available in the world, and there wasn't much wine from New Zealand available in the world. On the one hand, in New Zealand they didn't have wine, and in Romania all of that wine was being directed towards Russia and the communist bloc. Both of these regions then made major efforts to bring their wines to the world market. And the way they did this, to me, is extremely illuminating. New Zealand began from the beginning by saying, we cannot possibly compete on price. Our land is too expensive, our labor is too expensive, we don't have enough people. And everything they were doing was new, which meant there were no established costs, the machinery was all new, and so they had a very specific focus. We cannot possibly go cheap, we have to go quality and expensive. They came to the U.S. with what was the most expensive Sauvignon Blanc anyone had ever heard of, at $36 a bottle back 20 years ago. And of course they didn't sell any of it, but they got the world talking about the fact that the people in New Zealand were doing something rather special. And by the time they came in with the not individual vineyard designated $36 bottles of Sauvignon Blanc, but with the $15 reserve bottles, they sold a lot of wine. And then when they came in with the current releases, in those days $10, now it's closer to 12 or 14, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc took over the world and became an iconic brand. Romania did just the opposite. Romania came in and said, we can undercut anybody in terms of price. The wines were not bad. They have the capability of making quite good wines, but the goal in their case was always, how much wine can we move as quickly as possible? And of course what happened is fighting for the lowest possible bottle price is never a long-term marketing solution. Sooner or later someone will always undercut you. And in order to maintain that positioning, you have to go cheaper and cheaper, which ultimately means lower and lower in quality. And as a result, the wines of Romania have absolutely no reputation in the world today, other than if you find them, oh, they're really cheap and they're not very good. So if you're going to introduce a new brand, if you're going to introduce a new region to the world, it pays off to aim high, to be very strict in terms of what you allow out of the country, to focus on quality, and to be absolutely rigorous in that approach. And if you do, you can maintain that perception. Today, the average bottle price of New Zealand wine in the U.S. market is the highest of any region in the world. It is much higher than France, for example. So mission very much accomplished. And where do they go from here? Well, if you think they make good Sauvignon Blanc, wait till you taste their Pinot Noir, and they're looking for ways to expand that, always aiming to enter at the very top end of the market and say, see if you can beat this. On the other hand, marketing theory absolutely predicted the whole process of Yellowtail, and to a certain extent now we're seeing the same thing play out with Prosecco. Yellowtail came to the market at a time when people knew about Australian wines. Australian wines had a fair amount of visibility in the market. People knew about Shiraz, they knew it was good. Somebody had heard of Grange, for example. But those wines were not available on a massive scale. Yellowtail came in, and classic marketing theory says when there is a well-defined category, sooner or later a major producer will monopolize that category by producing a massive amount of wine with the essence of the category at a low price, and everyone will think of that wine as, oh yeah, Australian wine, Yellowtail. They become the expression of that category. Prosecco, to a certain extent, has done the same thing with sparkling wine. When you ask young people what is sparkling wine, they say, oh, you mean Prosecco. Actually, we don't mean Prosecco, but young people believe that Prosecco has been spectacularly successful at establishing itself as a brand throughout the world. And the question is, how did they do it? They captured exactly what people wanted. In the case of Yellowtail, they captured the sense this was Aussie. There's a kangaroo on the label. Certainly wasn't true of Grange, for example. In Prosecco, there's a party in every bottle. That's the marketing message they developed. And in each of those cases, it was enormously, enormously successful. Question is, what do you do next? Yellowtail expanded into a series of other varietal wines. Very successful plans. They are by far, they're one of the largest wine brands in the world. And that's successful on one level. On the other level, one of the things they've tried is to introduce reserve wines and upscale wines. Those have been less successful because people who know Yellowtail, they have a perception of it as being a $5 or $6 bottle of wine. Who wants to get the good version of a $6 bottle of wine? I'd rather get a really good bottle of wine. So that's a bit of a challenge. Prosecco, on the other hand, is at an earlier stage of that development, because Prosecco is really just one wine. It's sparkling white wine, and of course now the big news is, will they produce a Prosecco Rosé? They can't do it from Glera, their traditional grape, but they can probably make a rosé. And so Prosecco may very well be right now on the road to, if Yellowtail makes 8 or 12 different varietal wines all under the Yellowtail banner, will Prosecco ultimately make a bunch of different sparkling wines under the Prosecco banner? Be interesting to see. I think it's more difficult for them, but certainly they have absolutely changed the way the world thinks about sparkling wine, and kudos to them for that. I don't know if you were able to do much research on this, but this is one of my favorite stories in the California wine industry. Camomi, owned by Dario Di Conti, who is a very, very polished winemaker from Italy. He was originally sent to California as the sales representative for an Italian filtration company. Now, Italy makes fabulous wine filters, in fact, possibly the best filtration units in the world. And their concern was, in most cases in the United States, particularly in California, winemakers didn't understand filtration and they didn't use it very successfully. It was considered to be a flaw if you had to filter your wine much, and they really didn't understand how using filtration in different ways could create very different scenes in the wine and ultimately salvage a lot of wine that they were currently pretty much writing off. So Dario Di Conti came to California. He started selling filters, and one of the things he would do is actually show up at a winery and say, show me a problem wine and I will show you what my filter can do to fix it. He was pretty successful at that. But oftentimes it turns out he didn't sell the filter, but they ended up selling him the wine very, very cheap because they said, no, we don't want to deal with that. Dario began this brand by simply taking wines that other people didn't want, applying his sophisticated filtration and winemaking skills to them, and turning them into extremely successful and extremely marketable wines. So quite a remarkable guy, quite a wonderful guy. I always learn something when I talk to Dario Di Conti. It may surprise you to know that they make hundreds of thousands of cases of wine. This is not a small operation. And they make wine for any number of people under custom labels. He has such a good reputation that he has an entire sales force that just calls on major distributors, major retailers, major restaurant chains, and says, you know, instead of buying somebody else's wine, why don't you sell your own wine in these shops or these restaurants? And your profit margins are higher, and I can guarantee you the quality is great. So they sell a small amount, I don't want to say a tiny amount, but a small amount of wine. It's certainly well less than half their production under the Camomi label. And the rest of their wine they sell under private labels all over the country. If you ever do get a chance to try their Camomi Red Blend, it's a superlative wine for an incredibly inexpensive price, and it really should be everybody's house wine. It's quite amazing. Where do they go from here? That's limited by Dario Di Conti's imagination, because he keeps finding clever ways to use his ability, his winemaking blending and his winemaking filtration ability to create almost something out of nothing. Quite a great story in the California wine industry. Here I'm going to let you do some of the talking, not of course on this podcast, but at least a little bit, because you sat through this and I did not. But I love this idea that, is Dalla Terra a unique vision? Are there other companies who have come to the world wine market by saying, we have pre-selected a group of wines that are really great for you from all sorts of different regions? And of course the answer is Yes, going back into the 50s, Frederick Wildman did this. There are other people who have done this. It works, but it ultimately gives rise to one of the most complicated brand discussions that any company can ever have. And the example I will use is Nabisco, the National Biscuit Company. And remember Nabisco, often for years they put the little red triangle in the upper corner saying this is a Nabisco brand, and sometimes they take it off and sometimes they put it on, and sometimes it's big and sometimes it's small. That's because some of the smartest and most intelligent, professional marketers in the world have disagreed as to how this works. Because on the one hand, Oreos are Oreos, and they're a brand of themselves. And the one theory is brands should stand on their own capabilities. If they're good enough to make it, we should blow them out and take full advantage of it. If they're not good enough, we should pull them off the shelves. The other philosophy says, no, our umbrella Nabisco means something to people over a broad range of products. And while Oreos may be one of our top products, we can use that brand halo to enhance the value of these other products. But if that is enhancing the value of the other products, the implication is those other products don't quite have the same quality. Same issue with Delaterra. Is every wine of equal quality and equal character? If so, then maybe they stand on their own, or do they carry a Delaterra brand name in big letters on every label, and it is the brand itself that carries forward? And that's a question that I can't answer. That's a question that people at Nabisco can't answer. It's a long-standing discussion in the world of marketing. But as you look at your business and your growth patterns, one of the questions you have to say is, should I have a single umbrella under which a lot of different things happen, or should I have a few star products that stand on their own, loosely affiliated with some sort of company umbrella? No easy answer to that one. This one was lots of fun to talk about, Sograp USA. Of course, we know the history. This is the brand that Mathieu Rosé created. And it was at one point the most popular wine in the world, sold still in over 130 countries, I believe. So by any definition, that's a successful brand. The question is, moving forward, where do they go from here? And of course, as you pointed out to me in your summaries, Stephen Brower is now in charge of the U.S. Arm of Sograp, which is called Eviton. And they have a much more strategic plan moving forward. They have introduced a series of wines from various regions around Portugal, hoping to become the face of Portuguese wine throughout the world. And they've also created some non-regional wines, but rather some wines that, much like Mathieu Rosé, are Portuguese wines without being wines from the Douro or the Duero or the Dow or Alentejo. They are simply Portuguese wines. So interesting challenges for them moving forward, but I think they've clearly thrown their hat into the ring, for they want to become the expression of Portuguese wine in the world, and they're going to continue to do that on a number of very different levels. Question is, will they be successful? Not because they can whether or not they can do it, but whether or not there are other companies who take them on, some of the big port houses, to become that single iconic "We Are Portugal" brand. And Santa Margarita is in some ways the same situation, but they got their very different path. Santa Margarita, again, remember how they entered the U.S. market. They created a white wine that would be competitive both on price and quality with American Chardonnay. They created that wine specifically to compete in Italian restaurants, and they specifically made it at just a slightly lower price, but it was completely unknown in the U.S. So when they came to Italian restaurants and said, you can sell this one-on-one, straight up against your California Chardonnays, but the profit margins are higher, and you are offering your customers an authentic Italian experience in your authentic Italian restaurant, that's a sales pitch that's going to appeal to the restaurants, and it's ultimately a sales pitch that's going to appeal to the restaurant consumers. As a result, Santa Margarita became one of the real success stories in the history of wine in the United States. They are currently, in the minds of most consumers, the iconic brand for Italy. And the question is, where do they go next? They have wineries in the foothills of the Alps. They have wineries in Tuscany, in Sardinia, in Sicily, and they are attempting to do just what we talked about in terms of Sograp. They are attempting to become Santa Margherita, the iconic brand of all of Italy. If you want to know about Italian wine, begin and end with Santa Margherita. Let's see if they pull it off. Boy, this is different, huh? From looking at brands that attempt to capture a region, here's a brand that had one single focus. How do we capture the world's attention as a varietal? They created only one wine, Pinot Noir. It grew out of Joey Wagner's love of Pinot, and again, he has the Bellegoisse brand, which makes very small amounts of very high-end Pinot. But he believed he could create an inexpensive Pinot, not that inexpensive, certainly not in the $10 range, more the $20 range, that could really revolutionize the market for Pinot Noir. And he was right. He had enormous resources to begin with. He had his father's brand, Caymus, which gave him an entry into every single distributor, retailer, and restaurant in America. He was passionate about this. He was excited about this. He used those connections to leverage that position in the market. When people tasted it, they loved it. At the same time, he also had the winemaking expertise and equipment that the Wagner family, no relation to me again, had at Caymus, at Mer Soleil, and some of their other facilities. So when he set about making this wine, he had all the pieces in place. All he needed to do was buy the grapes and create the vision. But then what he delivered into the marketplace was, have you ever wanted to try Pinot Noir? Try Meiomi and you're going to love it. He created the wine specifically to appeal to the palate of American consumers, and he was absolutely successful at it. Question is, what's next? Because, of course, after he did that, he sold the brand, and again, no vineyards, no winemaking facility, but he sold the brand, then selling 750,000 cases to Constellation for over $300 million. He was signed on to be the consulting winemaker for a while, but ultimately what he wants to do is go on and make very good and very high-priced Pinot Noirs from tiny little vineyards all over the country, at least, or that's what he says. But in the meantime, the Constellation immediately said, just as we saw with Yellowtail and Prosecco, we have a powerful brand here. How can we expand this brand? How can we offer more products to our existing customers? And so they took Meiomi Pinot Noir and expanded it to include Chardonnay. They have added a few other things as well. And the question is, how successful will that be when Meiomi was so closely tied to Pinot Noir? Can they build that brand out? Of course, the winemaking facilities and expertise at Constellation are second to none, so that's not a question. The question is, when people fall in love with a single brand, single concept, do they want to see that expanded? And if it expands, does it dilute the brand message? And we're right back to the Nabisco conversation again. Satui is fun, huh? I think the most fun I had in this class was working on that quick cocktail napkin P&L for a brand and deciding we'd use Satui, and I think everybody's eyebrows went up when we saw just exactly how this business model works. Again, they began because Dario Satui got to the Napa Valley and said, gosh, everybody's giving lectures on wine and organizing tastings. People just want to have a picnic, and he made that possible. He made it so possible that he was absolutely swamped. He had all the permits to do this. Bear in mind, there were a number of other wineries that had similar permits who were not doing it because they didn't believe it was appropriate. Dario did believe it was appropriate and grew that into what is easily the most profitable wine tasting room in California. There are a couple of others in Missouri, in North Carolina, and a few other places in Spain where there are some supremely effective tasting rooms. But Setui is certainly in the top 5-10 in the world. And the question, of course, is not, wow, does it work? It works brilliantly. And it works so brilliantly that he built an entire Italian castle and now has an equally successful program up there. Perhaps not quite as profitable, but certainly aiming at a different level of consumer and doing that just as successfully. So the question is, what does he do next? And I loved the ideas that some of my students presented. I loved the idea that we had the possibility of opening a V Setui in Tuscany, a V Setui in upper New York State, lots of different places where he could do this. Remember, he's an older man. I say that because he's older than I am. And I think one of the real questions about V Setui moving forward is, what happens to it when Dario, the original visionary, isn't there anymore to drive the vision forward? And I don't know the answer to that question, but certainly would be fun to be on board as part of it. Now we're going to move into the last three. And the first brand is Ravenswood. And if you go back in time, you will discover that Ravenswood was started by a single individual, Joel Peterson, who encouraged a group of basically his parents' friends to invest in a small little project that he thought might work by making some really good Zinfandel. He was a really good winemaker. He still is a really good winemaker. The wines had intensity, they had balance, they had concentration, but most importantly, they had Joel Peterson, one of the best storytellers I know in the wine business, who traveled around the country hundreds of days a year, telling his story, getting to meet consumers, and really building that brand. So the brand built itself on the basis of a single varietal and a single person. As his parents' friends reached their elderly years, and Joel's about my age, it became clear that they wanted to pull their investment out. And as Joel thought about ways that he could pay off and buy out his partners, he soon realized that it was worth way more money than he could raise, and he sold the entire project to Constellation. $145 million, something like that. Again, what were they buying? No vineyards, or few acres of vineyards. A large barn of a production facility in Sonoma County, not attractive, but well designed to make good wine, but certainly Constellation wasn't paying $145 million for a winery. What they were paying $145 million for were the absolutely devoted fans of Ravenswood, who knew Joel Peterson, who loved his wines, had met him, and would buy anything he made. They kept him on as the consulting winemaker for a while, but of course one of the things they did was, as we see in all of these brand acquisitions, the next step is, how can we maximize the impact of this brand? And they introduced Chardonnay, and they introduced Cabernet, and they expanded the portfolio with the idea of taking those Ravenswood wine drinkers and being able to expand them into a whole nother set of varietals that were all made theoretically, and at least initially, with Joel Peterson's input and advice. Of course, he was no longer on the road hundreds of days a year promoting the wines. Of course, it was easy to say Ravenswood is one of the three great R's in Zinfandel. Ridge, Ravenswood, and Rosenblum were the three R's. But these days, I don't think people see Ravenswood the same way. I was amused to see that within weeks of when Joel Peterson had announced that he was selling the winery to Constellation, that there were some on wine message boards who were saying the wines were no longer as good now that Joel wasn't making them. Of course, he'd made those wines. It would be 2 years before any wines that weren't made 100% by Joel Peterson reached the market. But people were quick to immediately say it can't be any good anymore because it's owned by somebody else. So they're owned by Constellation, although I think they were part of the project that Constellation just sold to Gallo. The pricing has gone consistently down. The reputation of Ravenswood as a very high-end, very top-quality producer of Zinfandel, I think, has suffered in the process. Joel certainly made his investors happy. He certainly left his mark on the U.S. market. But Ravenswood as a brand is something very different today than it was when he sold it 8 years ago or so. So let's talk about a region again instead of a winery brand. And let's talk about Champagne. Let's start by saying, why do you make wine with bubbles here? And the answer is, it's because you can't make still wine here. It's too cold. If you've ever tasted the still wine of Champagne, Bouzy, it's really tart, it's really unattractive, it's really no fun to drink. And it's no surprise that what they did back in those ancient days when the wine was so tart and so tight and so lean was they added extra sugar to it. This is a classic old world technique. After phylloxera it was called Chaptal, but Chaptalization has been around forever. And of course, one of the things they discovered, if you add sugar to a wine that still has yeast in it, is, it starts fermenting again and bubbles and all the rest. There is some evidence, by the way, that the English actually invented this process for exactly the same reasons. But of course, we all know the real story now, which is that Champagne is the wine of celebration throughout the world. And why is it called Champagne? Because it comes from that very specific delineated region of Europe called Champagne. And remember, of course, that you can't call it Champagne unless it comes from that region, and they're very strict about that. They sue people all over the world when they attach Champagne to any product, and they're very specific. This is where it has to come from. Question you might ask is, how did Champagne become the wine of celebration? And that goes back a couple hundred years. The Champenois, I think, have always had a real gift for marketing. Remember, they're a bit like Alsace and Lorraine. They're sort of between France and Germany, and to a certain extent spoke to both populations. They marketed their wine on an international basis, where many producers in Europe marketed to the local community. Champagne, it's expensive to make, it's labor intensive, and we got to get top dollar for this. We got to get people to drink it. And they aimed at the crowned heads of Europe. The Russian Tsar, Winston Churchill, all of these people were huge fans of Champagne. And for example, when they entered the US market, one of the most famous wine marketers of all time, Charles Heidsieck, known by his friends and his fans as Champagne Charlie, would show up in New York and Philadelphia. He would show up at the opera. He would show up at all the best clubs. He would pour his champagne, and he would make Champagne the wine of celebration. This happened. All of the major champagne houses have stories like this. And they still do that today. Champagne is marketed completely different than any other wine in France. And unlike most wines in the world, there are very few other wines that underwrite, for example, Formula One racing. That's Champagne. There are very few wines that decide to be a corporate sponsor of James Bond and get that kind of publicity, which Dom Perignon did in one of the early Bond films. So they have a very different vision of marketing, and I think we need to give them credit for the fact that they've done it extremely well. So what happens from here? Well, the reason I asked what happened in 2008 was, in Champagne, they began to realize that they could no longer produce enough champagne to meet the market demand, and they were in fact pricing themselves out of the market, and they were seeing inroads being made by Cava, Prosecco, sparkling wine from the New World, Franciacorta, Sekt in Germany. And so they took the obvious decision of saying, well, Champagne just got larger. And so they actually, in fact, increased that area. The only area you can make Champagne, they suddenly made it larger so they could make more Champagne. So it turns out you could make Champagne from those other regions, but only if the Champenois said so. So a little bit of a marketing brouhaha, but the irony is no consumer ever followed this news. They will still tell you you can only make Champagne from Champagne. They just don't know which part part of Champagne that includes the old part or the new part. And the question is, where do they go from here? I think they keep hammering the idea that they are the wine of celebration. They are the wine of your wedding. You may serve your guests something else, but the wedding couple always has a bottle of champagne. And as long as they keep that going on, as long as this is a region that can sell the worst wine and food pairing on the planet, which is wedding cake and dry champagne, they will continue to be successful. And our last case study today is in some ways the most interesting and the most complicated. The story of Robert Mondavi is really not a lot different from the story of Joel Peterson and Ravenswood. It's just that Robert started sooner and established himself earlier. He originally, of course, you know the story, was with Charles Krug Winery with his brother. They had a falling out, Robert believing that the future lay in marketing. Peter believed that the future lay in production, and of course those were the two roles they played at the winery. And so Robert Mondavi, eventually thrown out of his family winery, gathered a group of investors and started his own winery. He wanted to be the first winery you saw as you drove into the Napa Valley. That's why the winery is down there. He took out acres and acres of the world-famous To Kalon vineyard to plant that winery there, so you can see how important that was to him. And he spent 275 days a year on the road, traveling around America and telling people what wine was all about. He became, obviously from the name, synonymous with the winery. And people wouldn't talk about Robert Mondavi Winery. They would talk about Robert Mondavi. And in fact, they would call him Bob. He is, to this day, one of the very few people of his stature in the wine industry anywhere in the world. And again, he's also one of those people who was quite likely to stand on the front steps of his winery on a Tuesday morning, and as tourists got out of their cars, he'd greet them and say, "Hi, welcome to my winery. I'm Bob Mondavi. Let's set you up on a tour." You don't see people doing that in the Napa Valley today, certainly not people of his stature. He understood that the most important thing to do in all of this was establish a connection between the human being who made the wine, the human being who was drinking it, and a shared vision of what wine meant to them. Culture, civilization, lifestyle, elegance, luxury. And Robert Mondavi was the embodiment of that caring, cultured personality. He was enormously successful. And he also began to realize, because of his background, remember that Charles Krug not only made Charles Krug wines, but a less expensive brand underneath those. So Robert Mondavi first began not only with his Napa Valley wines, but inexpensive wines from Lodi, which were called Robert Mondavi Red and Robert Mondavi White, aka in the wine business, Bob Red and Bob White. And those eventually became a whole new brand of wine for him called Robert Mondavi Woodbridge, and then he had a brand in between that tier and his Napa Valley wines called Robert Mondavi Private Selection. So he was making Robert Mondavi wines at every price point from about $6 a bottle up to $100 a bottle in various wineries around Northern California. It was very successful, and as he looked at his retirement, he started looking at the idea that he had a grander vision. He wanted to start Copia, for example, the Center for Wine, Food, and the Arts. That was a Robert Mondavi vision. He wanted to give an enormous donation to Davis and created the Fine Arts facility at Davis. So he wanted to trade his vision for wine and his brand for wine into a larger vision of what constitutes a civilized lifestyle and includes wine. And he decided the solution was to go public. So they went public and sold off a significant portion of the shares of the winery. In fact, they sold off a majority of the shares in the winery. And what happened was, of course, as in any public company, shareholders want to have a vote and they want to have a say in what happens next. Robert Mondavi had a board of directors, he had employees, and he certainly had, for example, his children, Michael, Tim, Marcia, who all played key roles at the winery. But ultimately, the people making the decisions, now that they were a public company, were shareholders. Now, Robert had a very clear vision for how all of this worked. He wanted the Robert Mondavi Winery to be the halo brand. He wanted it to be the locomotive that would pull this enormous train of cash flow, quality, and revenue through the business. And so he skimped at nothing at Robert Mondavi Winery because he understood that that winery was the flagship for the entire Robert Mondavi family of wineries and brands. But once you get into publicly held companies, one of the questions some of those people started asking, they were along the lines of, why are we losing money at Robert Mondavi Winery in Napa? Shouldn't it make money since it's the crown jewel of our portfolio? Now, Bob had always said, you don't have to make money here. The Robert Mondavi Winery is about building brand awareness and creating this halo effect around the other brands. But the board of directors said, I think we need to make sure that everything's being managed successfully, and so they reduced the amount of money available to Robert Mondavi Winery Napa for marketing. They reduced the expenses that would go against building the brand, and they invested more in Robert Mondavi Woodbridge and Robert Mondavi Private Selection. Big volume players, huge volume players, but ultimately in the end they don't add value. It's the Robert Mondavi name in Napa Valley that adds value to those brands, not the other way around. They're now owned by Constellation. Constellation is fighting exactly that same Nabisco challenge. Do we call everything Robert Mondavi? And then, of course, for every bottle of Robert Mondavi Napa Valley we sell that we want to be the Rolls Royce of fabulous wines, we're also selling 100 bottles of an $8 Robert Mondavi Woodbridge wine, and most people know us for those rather than the top quality and what ultimately is the image of our brand in the world. And the question is, what do they do? And again, I would use an example from another industry. When Mercedes introduced its C-Class to the United States, Mercedes was always considered a luxury car. C-Class is not an expensive car. And when they introduced that, people loved it. Everybody wanted to have a C-Class Mercedes. They sold lots of those cars. But the people who had bought E-Class Mercedes, the really expensive ones, were really quite upset and were, in the end, not nearly so happy with their Mercedes because now anybody can afford a Mercedes. And the question is, what's in the best long-term interest of the brand? And on the one hand, you have Mercedes and you have Robert Mondavi saying, we're pretty darn successful brands. On the other hand, you have companies like Tiffany and Cartier who say, we will never discount. LVMH, we will never discount, because to discount, to offer products at a lower price, ultimately compromises the future of the brand forever. So the next time you're looking at what to do in your company, you can think of all these case studies and say, boy, no wonder I'm having trouble with this decision. This is one that people all over the world have struggled with. Some of the smartest people in the world have struggled with these brands, and they still don't have an easy answer. I'll be open for questions if we can put this online, and look forward to hearing from you.